Good morning. I'm Dr. Eva Oberle, and I'm an assistant professor with the Human Early Learning Partnership in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the unceded traditional lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish people. Now, as part of HELP's Coffee Talk series, I've hosted a session just a couple of days ago on outdoor play, and I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Mariana Brizzoni about the importance of outdoor play in childhood. Now, today I've invited Megan Zeni to follow up on this conversation, to build on it, and to talk about outdoor learning. So really, the question is today about how can we bring the outdoors into the classroom, or in other words, what happens when we shift learning in schools outside. Now, Megan is a teacher in the Richmond School District. She currently teaches fully outdoors, and she's also an independent consultant across the province where she offers her knowledge and her experience on outdoor learning in schools. Megan also is very busy. She's a PhD student in the Faculty of Education, and she conducts her dissertation research on curriculum and pedagogy with a focus on outdoor learning. Now, thank you very much, Megan, for joining me today. We're very pleased, very lucky to have you. And I mean, I don't know how you're feeling, but I'm definitely, as part of our family, I'm definitely gearing up for the back to school transition here. And this year, due to COVID-19, school will look a little bit different for children and for families, and also for teachers and staff. So I have many questions, really, but I think I have to limit it to about 3 questions because we only have half an hour together. And I'd like to ask you a little bit about your experience with outdoor learning in schools. What are some of the barriers? What are the opportunities? And why is it maybe particularly important during the current times? So, as I said, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So I think it's actually a great time to revisit and to reimagine educational practices in our school system. And my question for you is, what role do you think outdoor learning can play during the return to school this year? And can we maybe even address some of the challenges that the pandemic imposes on us by shifting more of our learning in schools outside?
Yeah, so we have an amazing opportunity to sort of rethink where learning happens. And so when we go back into schools, I'm hoping that the momentum that we're seeing a lot of momentum with colleagues and with parents, with a real increased appetite for taking learning outdoors. So what that requires is for schools and teachers to sort of get creative about where we teach in schools and rethinking where those shared spaces of learning can be in our schools. So lots of schools have beautiful spaces attached to their schoolyards, and some just have a concrete pad in a parking lot. And that's okay, because there's lots of interesting ways and creative ways that we can take kids outdoors to play and to learn. But I think the priority for a lot of teachers as we get back, particularly in the first few weeks, is going to be giving children opportunities to be social and socially interact with each other. A lot of children have been kept apart from each other since March. A lot of families have been really diligent about keeping their children away from other families and children. So we're going to see a real need for children to have lots of unstructured time to play and reconnect. And I know a lot of teachers from different chat groups that I'm in online are really going to be focusing on the social emotional learning needs of children in those first few weeks back, just as everybody reconnects and get used to the new normal, for sure.
Mhm. So how can I, I'm trying to imagine this now when you talk about learning outdoors. And when I think about learning, I'm kind of thinking of the classroom setting. I'm thinking maybe of the desks and the chairs, and I'm trying to think, well, how can we shift this outdoors? Does learning look differently outdoors? Does it look the same? How can this be done?
Yeah, so in my position, this will be my 5th year that I'm going into now teaching entirely outdoors. For the previous many years, over 20 years, I had been teaching outdoors as an enrolling teacher where I would take my class outside for big chunks of time during the day. And that we didn't take our desks, we would just maybe take a clipboard, or maybe we would just go and discuss and observe and look closely. But my position now in the school, which is, we're seeing a lot more districts take this on, and this model is spreading because it's very effective. It's very cost effective, and it's an efficient use of existing staff in a school. So in elementary schools, K to 7, teachers receive prep time. That's in our contract, that in British Columbia, teachers receive 110 minutes of prep time a week. So my role is now I've given up the enrolling position as being a classroom teacher, and now I am a prep teacher. So what that means is that when the teacher is taking their prep time, the children need to be under another teacher's supervision. So I come to the classroom, I collect the children, and I take them outside. So I personally am outside all day for the entire school day, but the groups of children rotate. So every 55 minutes, there's a new group of children coming outside. And that's been a really effective way to get kids outside for a minimum of 2 hours of learning a week.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so in my classroom is mostly a garden. We have some tables, we have a huge garden space. Gardens are great spaces for learning. They're really rich environments for teaching across the curriculum. So we teach all the math, the science, the literacy, the social studies, the art, the ADST, which is part of our curriculum now, our core and curricular competencies. We can teach all of that outdoors. We don't need textbooks. We don't need pencils or paper. Sometimes we do, but they're not necessary. And it's just a reframing of how we think about what learning looks like and how do we make learning visible. So that's a big thing for teachers is like, if I don't have a worksheet, how do I show what they learned, right? So assessment looks a little different outdoors. And I know we're going to be linking to some resources, but on my blog, I talk a lot about how we do assessment outdoors. I talk a lot about different ways of tackling literacy when we're teaching literacy outdoors. So we don't need to be doing a lot of written output. Because what's really nice about teaching outdoors is it's a lot more equitable for learners. So when we have children who are struggling, for example, with written output in the classroom, if you're a young learner, you're in grade 1 or grade 3, and you're struggling to write, taking you outside to do your writing isn't really changing that barrier for you, right? It's just making it more frustrating for you because now we've got these other elements as part of the learning environment. So we can have children work on story, or we can have children work on vocabulary development in different ways outdoors that actually increase motivation and engagement in learning. And we've got some good research that shows us that actually the academic outcomes are much increased by teaching outdoors as opposed to doing something in a worksheet inside. Yeah.
That's really, well, that's fascinating. To hear from you that learning outdoors is actually working for both the children, but also for the teachers. It seems like it is something where the teacher can go through an outdoor learning setting and say, yes, I am bringing across, or I am teaching what I want to be teaching to the children. So I'm curious, can you give me a few examples of learning activities? I know you have a blog, and you have lots of great examples there, always with great pictures. But maybe you can share a couple of activities here. For example, some activities to teach math to children outdoors.
Yeah. So for one of the big questions we get from teachers is, what do we do when we go outside, right? So the advice that I often give teachers, and on my website, I have a blog post on top 10 tips for transitioning to teaching outdoors. So for teachers that are used to being inside, how do they start even thinking about going outside? Math and science are really easily taught outside, but one of the ways that I sort of encourage people who are new to this, teachers who are thinking, I've never done this, I don't even know where to start, is to sort of look at their day plan and what they were planning to do that day and ask themselves, what about this lesson has to be done inside?
Mhm.
In our K-7 context, there's very little that requires you to actually be inside unless you're using some very sensitive equipment. But even now with iPads and waterproof cases, and most schools are putting pretty kid-proof, durable cases on all their tech now anyways, most of that translates well to being used outdoors. So in most cases across the curriculum, almost anything a teacher wants to do can be done just outside. So if you're reading a book aloud, for example, you can just go outside and read it under the tree, right? If you're looking in math and you're going to be counting or working on what's sometimes called counting collections, you can go out and collect groups of five pine cones or 5 leaves, and create these sets and groups, and then work on skip counting that way. Rather than using a worksheet to show addition, you can go out and use these, what we call loose parts, to show numeracy in different ways. So math from K-7 is easily taught outdoors, all the science curriculum. But what I often really advocate for with teachers is to embrace an emergent curriculum. And it's in my list of tips in that blog post, the top 10 tips. An emergent curriculum just means that we have all this curriculum that we're required to teach from the Ministry of Education, And just really knowing that and having that in your toolbox, but also being really open to following the interests of children. Because if we take children outdoors just to let them play in a garden or in a schoolyard, or we go to a park, or we go for a walk somewhere in nature, they will find something interesting to learn about. And then what a skilled teacher can do is then sort of weave the curricular content into whatever curiosity a child has found that's interesting for them. And that makes it really meaningful, and it's really responsive to the interests of the children. And what I find is that at the end of the term, because I do have to still write report cards on what we've learned, even though we've done a short-term plan and a long-term plan, monthly plans and whole term plans, we, through the emergent curriculum, have actually taught way more than we thought we would, because there's such an abundance of learning outdoors that nurtures that curiosity and wonder for kids far more than any textbook ever will.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is, it's fascinating. And what I'm connecting here are the pieces of the conversation I had with Mariana a few days ago, where she really talked about this benefit of the unstructured component in outdoor play. And I think you're referring to this here too, where you talk about the self-directedness in learning, which also refers to this unstructured component, and you connect it with the emergent curriculum. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, you as a teacher, because you've done this now for several years, you've taught outdoors, what are other benefits you see for the children? Because you've now known children in this outdoor learning experience for a long time, and you can see over and above the specific skill you want to teach them. Do you see other benefits of having them outdoors?
Yeah, so there's a laundry list of benefits. And always for me, my biggest benefit for kids is the improvement in relationship with children. Mm-hmm. So the relationship between adults and children, you really change the power dynamic when you teach outdoors with children. You introduce the environment as a teacher as well. And so there's sort of this triangle relationship that develops that's a lot healthier than just the sometimes dysfunctional dyad between an adult and a child in a classroom. So taking children outdoors really shifts that relationship in a far more positive way. And often between kids who have conflict, you see that the being outdoors gives them more space. There's a lot more engagement. They tend to work through conflicts in a more satisfying way to everybody who's engaged in that conflict. So there's huge improvements in relationships being outdoors. So the improvement in the relationship with the adults, the improvement in relationships between children, and then of course, improvement in relationship with place and land. Children get to know their place. They become much more interested in what is happening in their schoolyard. And even if you're in one of these urban schools that have concrete pads, there's so many weeds and cracks that kids can get to know, and they start following and looking at insects, and they start to develop a relationship with the biodiversity of your schoolyard that they may not have had before, that gives them a little more empathy towards living things, which is really great. So relationships is my number one benefit, I think, but also there's huge improvement in children's ability to self-regulate. So when we have children that we are asking them to work on something that we might call a non-preferred task, something that they don't want to do inside, when they come back in from being outside, they're just a little easier to get along with. Kids are just easier to get along with when they've been outside for a while. So being outdoors is just, it's good for everybody. And that goes back to
I love how you call these the non-preferred tasks. I definitely have some non-preferred tasks, and I feel much better if I've been outside.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I also appreciate you referring to outdoor learning as potentially being an equalizer that, also supports children who maybe struggle a little bit more with the worksheet scenario and the structured sit-down classroom context. So there might be an opportunity to support specifically those children by shifting more learning outside. And, we heard a few days ago from Mariana, who talked about the importance of physical activity in children's lives and how a lot of children are not physically active enough. And it sounds like schools can even bring that into their curriculum very naturally by just shifting the math or the science or whatever they're doing to the outdoors.
Oh, totally. Like even you think about like friction, right? Like if I want to teach young children about friction and I'm going to read them something from a book about friction, they have no idea what I'm talking about. But when we go outdoors on a rainy day and we're running along the logs and I can talk about how, water is going to reduce friction and that means it's going to be slippery, we can actually slip and slide and run and we can play with friction. And now we have a really good understanding of what friction is. And then we can go back on a dry day and try to do the same thing. And they realize, well, there's friction here and I'm not sliding the same way. And so we can play in ways that are really accessible to learning for children, for sure. Even ideas of equal, everything, all of it can be taught outside.
It's a great example to show how there are great opportunities to make learning more meaningful to children. So I want to shift to the second question because I know we don't have that much time, and I want to talk a little bit about the barriers, because some teachers, teachers like you and a lot of other teachers, they love the idea of outdoor learning, and some are hesitant. Some maybe haven't been trained to incorporate outdoor learning into their curriculum, and some might have some other hesitations. So I'm curious, what are some of the current barriers to outdoor learning in schools? And this could be barriers at the level of educators or administrative barriers, or maybe families or children. But then most importantly, I'm curious if you can give us some understanding, well, how can we overcome those barriers?
Yeah, so the biggest barriers that we see in taking the learning outdoors for schools, and this is my own experience, but also from the work I've done with teachers across the province, is generally there's systemic barriers. They're big issues that are sort of feel overwhelming for a single teacher to try to solve. And so the biggest barrier that we have to being outdoors in Canada is the weather, right? And which climate you're in. So making sure that everybody is dressed to be outdoors is probably the most important first step for any teacher or school or district that's interested in accessing more outdoor learning for their students. And so that can mean that at a district level, they say, all right, we're going to issue these as a school supply. We've got this funding, or we're going to apply for these grants, or we're going to develop partnerships with these companies. And we're just going to issue everybody a pair of rain or snow pants, or a pair of waterproof gloves, or a pair of boots. I've never seen that happen, but all kinds of things are possible in this COVID world, right? What we do at our school is we've developed a lending library. So we have a library of waterproof pants and boots and coats and gloves that families who can't afford because their kids' feet are growing 4 sizes a month, they might come and take something for a month, and then they bring it back when they're done, or they might take it for the whole school year and they bring it back when they're done. The only request we have is that when you're finished with something, you return it. We do receive more than we give. People make donations all the time when their kids outgrow stuff. Lost and found, I go through the lost and found at the end of the year and keep all the good boots and pants and things that families have totally forgotten that their kids had. So making sure that you've got gear available for families to use is really important, and for kids to use, because on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, it really limits a teacher's ability to take kids outdoors, particularly in northern BC or in our northern climates, because if you've got children without gloves on, you really just can't go outside when it's minus 30, right? That becomes hazardous, and it's not sensible to be taking kids outdoors that aren't properly dressed for it. So making sure everybody has the gear they need to go outdoors. That's a big one.
That's an important point. And I think also what you're raising here is the need of like addressing this at a systemic level, because if you basically roll those costs over to families, then not all families may be able to actually provide children with the rain boots, the snow pants, and all of that gear that is needed. What about some other barriers? Maybe barriers that teachers experience, or barriers maybe families are not that supportive, or some families.
Yeah, so sometimes we'll see some pushback from families who feel like the only legitimate learning comes from a textbook, right? And so they have a very traditional paradigm of where and how learning happens. So they feel like if the children are outdoors, it must be just play, and just play doesn't translate to academic outcomes. So sometimes there's a lot of relationship building and communication around showing where and how the learning is happening outdoors. So for teachers, sometimes we see a lot of what we call professional learning network develop on Twitter or Instagram, and teachers will come together in little groups to sort of share what they're doing and show ways of making that learning visible. So teachers who are really interested in the Reggio Emilia approach, for example, might use pedagogical narration or documentation to show that process of learning and to show the really deep, meaningful learning that's happened, even though there isn't a worksheet or a test that has shown the outcome of learning. I would say that, yeah, some of the barriers for teachers are the pushback from colleagues or parents or administrators who want to see evidence of learning. And there's so many ways that we can show how learning has happened outside of tests and worksheets, for sure.
Yeah, so one of my thoughts here is also, I know this from my research on social emotional learning and social emotional competence and development in children, that to teach this in school kind of requires that teachers have worked on their own social emotional learning and their own social emotional competence. And over the years in that field of research, much more has shifted back to the teacher education program, where we realize that we need to incorporate social emotional learning into the teacher education program to provide teachers with SEL so they can actually teach it to students. Would you say there's a similar connection here with outdoor learning? Like, do we as adults need to connect with the outdoors so we can bring it to children?
Yeah, so one of the themes that I notice in talking to teachers is that teachers who have spent a lot of time outdoors as children themselves, or as parents bringing their own children outdoors, or just as adults who like mountain biking or kayaking or whatever their interest is, those teachers are far more interested in taking students outdoors because they feel comfortable in that space, right? One of the terms that I try to avoid when I'm working with teachers that are new to being outdoors is outdoor education, because outdoor education tends to raise the hackles of adults who don't like, they went to camp and it was wet and it rained and we had to tie knots and I don't know how to do any of that and I don't want to do that. So they immediately sort of have this bias around what outdoor education is. I tend to refer to it as the outdoor classroom, and that we're just really shifting our perceptions of where learning happens. So in teacher education programs, helping teachers see that learning can happen anywhere, anytime, and not just in a desk in a classroom. And you see that a lot in how classrooms are designed. Lots of classrooms are moving to tables instead of desks, and learning commons and libraries now are very common. So there's a huge shift towards this already, and taking the learning outdoors is just a natural extension of what's already happening.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. Also, that message of saying, every adult can do this, every teacher could do this. Of course, it requires some interest and just something like building your own little toolbox of resources of how to shift learning outside. And I know you do have some resources you recommend. Some of them are on your website, meganzeni.com. I also know that you have your Twitter feed, Room to Play, where you share regular resources, your own, but also many resources of others that are implementing outdoor learning successfully on a regular basis. So, I have a last kind of set of questions, and that's really, after all your years of teaching outside, what do you want families to know? What do you want teachers to know about the opportunities? The opportunities both for students, but also for teachers.
Yeah, it really will transform a child's experience of school being outdoors. For a lot of children, school is a very stressful, difficult place. And so for them, being outdoors gives them some space and some comfort in the school day to really thrive. It's, like I said before, a really equitable place and space of learning. And for teachers, I think what families need to remember, if we're seeing a lot more teachers go outdoors, is to just offer some grace, because it's going to be a bit of a transition for teachers trying to figure this out, and just trusting that teachers are going to make this work, because that's what teachers do, right? We're a very skilled group of professionals that will adapt, and teachers will adapt, but they're going to need some time and they're going to need some trust from families that this is going to work. Yeah. And then I would say for teachers, it's really important to connect to your colleagues who are already doing this work. There's a vast, I can put a list of 150, 200, 300 teachers just in British Columbia that are already doing this work expertly. There's so many people out there who are really, really good at this and have probably been working on the fringe for the last however many decades, because it was sort of a different way of teaching, right? They were quietly going about teaching outdoors. So find those people and talk to them and ask them to support you in your shift towards teaching outdoors, because almost every school has somebody who's already doing this. And then sort of lifting up their experience and expertise, and finding that professional learning network either on Twitter or Instagram, or going to, there's so many online conferences this fall. I'd really recommend anybody who's interested in this to enroll EPSA, which is the Environmental Educators PSA. EPSA is a really inexpensive way to network with other teaching colleagues across the province. There's a big conference on the Provincial Pro D Day, Classrooms to Communities. It'll be online. Yeah, those are great ways to network and meet other colleagues.
Thank you, Megan. Curious, do you ever think about shifting back indoors?
No, I could never teach indoors again. I slowly went from being outdoors like half the day to 3/4 of the day. And then I was like, now I'm outside 100%. I don't know. I couldn't be inside all day. It would be very, very challenging. It's just so easy to do it outdoors, and everybody's happier. The kids are more relaxed. I'm more relaxed. Everybody's just got a good vibe. It's so much easier, and everybody's easier to get along with. And the learning outcomes are much improved. So why would I go back inside? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Megan. This was really a wonderful conversation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, sharing your experience. I think especially now, in the current times of the pandemic, we're moving into the fall, moving to back to school, and teachers and schools are kind of trying to figure out, how can we do this? How can we do it best? How can we do it safely? What are some things we can maybe change? So I think it's a great opportunity to think about, what about outdoor learning, and how can we incorporate this? And even if not all teachers are going to be fully outdoors all the time, they might want to try it step by step and see how it works, and how it might address some of the challenges we're experiencing currently. So thank you very much. On behalf of everyone at HELP, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this last session we had on outdoor play and learning as part of the HELP Coffee Talk series. I've already mentioned that you have a website, meganzeni.com, and you have a Twitter account, Room to Play, where you share your own and a large number of other resources. So please check those out if you're interested. For those who would like to watch this again, or who'd like to refer friends or colleagues to this conversation, we have recorded the conversation, and it will be posted to the HELP's YouTube channel by the end of the week. Thank you very much, Megan.